It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just me and the mountains. I'd been planning the trip for months, working out the logistics, buying new gear, and making sure I was prepared for the solo experience. I'd camped in Colorado before, but never this far into the backcountry. This time, I chose a secluded spot, tucked away deep in the trees, miles away from any other hikers or campsites. I liked it that way. I liked the silence, the isolation, the sense of being completely alone. I arrived in the late afternoon, setting up my tent on a small patch of flat ground near a stream. The sound of the water flowing over rocks was calming, and I was excited to finally get out of the city. I had my pack sorted, set up my camp stove, and boiled water for a simple dinner of freeze-dried chili. The sun began to sink behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. By the time I finished eating and cleaned up, the sky was dark, and the stars were coming out in full force. I settled into my sleeping bag inside the tent, the slight chill of the evening creeping through the walls. I had my flashlight next to me, but I was too tired to do anything except close my eyes and listen to the forest. The wind rustled the branches overhead, and the occasional crack of a twig breaking somewhere in the distance kept me alert. There were coyotes out there, probably maybe a bear, but the odds of encountering one while they were out hunting were slim. Still, I kept the zipper of my tent closed tight. At some point, I drifted off to sleep. It wasn't a deep sleep, more like dozing, my mind half aware of the sounds around me. The wind grew colder, and the forest felt more alive in the darkness. I had an uneasy feeling, but I chalked it up to being alone in the woods. It was normal to feel on edge sometimes. Then, around 2 a.m., it happened. I woke up suddenly, feeling the sensation of something brushing against the underside of my tent. It was soft, almost like a hand or a paw, gently grazing against the fabric. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I lay completely still, listening hard, trying to figure out what it was. There were no footsteps, no rustling of leaves, just that slow, deliberate movement across the tent floor. I held my breath, straining my ears. Came again. A slow drag, this time directly beneath my sleeping pad. The fabric of the tent shifted as if something large and heavy was moving just under me. It felt so close I could almost feel the weight of it. My heart was pounding in my chest, and a cold sweat began to form on the back of my neck. I thought of animals, bears, coyotes, maybe even a mountain lion, but nothing about it felt right. It wasn't a casual animal passing by. It was something purposeful, like it was testing the tent, figuring out where I was. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The seconds stretched into minutes, and then the sound came again. A slow scrape, like claws dragging along the ground, coming from the same spot, just beneath my sleeping bag. It was getting closer to me. I could feel it, the presence of something just inches away, moving slowly, deliberately. My mind was racing. Should I grab my flashlight? Should I make noise? I didn't know what to do. I thought of the knife I had in my bag, but it was far out of reach. There was nothing I could do except wait, and that's exactly what I did. I waited in the dark, frozen with fear, listening to the strange sound moving beneath my tent. It seemed to last forever, but in reality, it was probably only a few minutes. Still, it felt like an eternity. Finally, the sound stopped. I waited a little longer just to be sure. My mind was spinning with possibilities. Maybe it was just an animal, maybe it wasn't anything at all, but that didn't feel like the right answer. I had a gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. I didn't want to be out there anymore. Not like this. The air inside the tent felt heavy, oppressive, like it was full of static. I tried to tell myself that I was overreacting, that it was just my imagination running wild in the dark, but deep down, I knew something had happened. Something had moved beneath me, something that didn't belong in the woods. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, lingered in the pit of my stomach. For the next hour, I stayed absolutely still, not daring to make a sound. Every little noise outside made my heart race. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the leaves, sent a jolt of panic through my body. I kept telling myself that I needed to stay calm, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that something had been there. After what felt like an eternity, I finally worked up the courage to unzip the flap of the tent, just a little so I could peek outside. I moved slowly, cautiously, trying not to make a sound. My hand trembled as I gripped the zipper, pulling it open just enough to see the ground outside. I scanned the area, but there was nothing. No animals, no tracks, no sign of anything unusual. Just the quiet darkness of the forest, the trees standing still in the night. I unzipped the tent completely and crawled out slowly, standing up on shaky legs. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam around the campsite. Everything looked normal. The fire pit was cold, the trees silent, the stream still flowing softly in the distance. Nothing had changed. No marks, no signs of what had brushed against my tent. It was as if it had never happened at all. But I knew it had. Something had been there. I didn't feel safe anymore. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful earlier, now felt hostile. The quiet, which had once been calming, now felt like a blanket of dread, suffocating me. I didn't want to spend another minute in that spot. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. I was getting out of there. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking, my mind racing. I didn't take the time to make everything neat or perfect. I just shoved everything into my pack, zipping it up without bothering to organize it. I didn't care about anything except leaving. The forest felt wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had brushed beneath my tent was still out there, watching me. I grabbed my flashlight and hurriedly made my way toward the trail. I didn't even look back at the campsite. I just kept walking, trying to put as much distance between me and whatever had been under my tent. The night was eerily quiet now, no sounds from the forest at all, not even the wind. I walked fast, not stopping to rest, not even caring where I was going. I just needed to get out. It wasn't until the first light of dawn began to show on the horizon that I felt some relief. The trees started to lose their shadows, and the forest began to wake up. The air felt different, less suffocating, and I felt like I could finally breathe again. I found a spot near a creek and sat down, my legs sore from the fast hike. I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but at least I was away from the campsite. I didn't sleep again that night. I didn't want to. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the movement beneath my tent, heard the slow drag across the fabric. But at least I was safe. I kept my eyes on the trail, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. I wasn't taking any chances. I eventually made my way back to the car before the sun fully rose. I didn't even look back as I drove away, not caring about the beauty of the mountains or the fact that I had to leave early. I just wanted to get as far from that place as possible. Whatever had been under my tent was still out there, and I wasn't sticking around to find out what it was. We'd been out there for hours, the kind of day where you lose track of time, wandering through thick stands of trees, checking out old logging trails that no one seemed to bother with anymore. The woods were dense, the air thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. I had my buddy with me, Steve, a guy who was always up for any kind of adventure, no matter how stupid it seemed. We'd spent days out in these woods before, walking miles, marking new spots we thought might make good places to camp, or spots where we could get lost and just disappear for a while. It was easy to let the day slip away when you're that far off the beaten path. We were following a trail we'd discovered on the edge of some old logging roads. The trees were tighter together here, and the trail had long been abandoned. No clear tracks, just a few scattered stumps and patches of crushed undergrowth. The sound of our boots on the dead leaves and twigs was the only noise in the air. We weren't looking for anything special, just exploring. Steve was ahead of me, moving at a pace that made it hard to keep up. He was always the first to find something interesting. I saw him stop suddenly, his back stiffening. "Hey, check this out," he said, his voice low, like he was unsure about what he'd found. I walked up behind him, and then I saw it too. There was a ring of small stones, arranged in a perfect circle, sitting on the forest floor. It was about the size of a small table, with the stones placed so carefully that at first glance, it almost looked like it belonged there. Inside the circle, scattered around like they'd been dropped in a hurry, were dozens of bones, small bones, rabbits, squirrels, maybe even birds, all cleaned, no meat left on them. Some of the bones were broken in odd ways, like they'd been snapped rather than chewed through. It didn't look like an animal had left them here. There was something off about it. I crouched down to get a closer look. The bones weren't scattered randomly. They were placed in a pattern, neat enough to be deliberate. I didn't like it, but I didn't know why. It felt wrong, like the kind of thing you're not supposed to find in the woods. Maybe a predator's stash, Steve said, his voice tentative. He was always trying to rationalize things, and I appreciated that about him. But this didn't feel like a predator's work. I reached for one of the bones, a rib from what looked like a rabbit. It was clean, too clean. There wasn't a trace of meat or fur. It didn't sit right. I pulled my hand back. It didn't feel like something a predator would do. A predator would eat what it caught, or at least drag it off to a hidden place. It wouldn't leave everything here, neatly arranged. That's when I noticed something else. Something that really made my stomach drop. Tied around a few of the bones were feathers, tied with what looked like sinew, and not in a haphazard way. The sinew was tied tight, and the feathers were arranged in patterns, almost like someone had placed them there on purpose. I couldn't stop staring at the feathers. They looked fresh, but not in a way that you'd expect. They didn't belong here. There was something intentional about how they were used. I stood up slowly, my heart rate picking up. Steve was still crouching, but I could see the way his eyes were darting around, like he was feeling the same unease. We both stood there for a minute, neither of us saying anything. The silence was heavy, thicker than it should have been for a place like this. The woods were always quiet, but now it felt different, like we were intruding on something. After a few moments, Steve broke the silence. It's probably some kind of animals, I don't know, nest or something. They've been dragging these back here. Yeah, I said, but I didn't believe it. The way the feathers were tied, the bones arranged so deliberately, it didn't make sense. I felt like we were standing in the middle of something that wasn't meant to be seen. Neither of us said anything more for a while. We just stood there, scanning the trees, listening to the wind rustle through the branches above us. It was hard to shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Let's go," I said finally. My voice didn't sound like my own, rough and tight. Steve looked at me like he was about to argue, but then he seemed to change his mind. He nodded slowly. We started walking back the way we came, trying to move quickly but not making it obvious. The whole way back, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something in the woods. But there was nothing, just trees, shadows, and the occasional bird call. We didn't talk much after that. When we got back to the old logging road, we didn't stop to catch our breath like we usually would. We just kept walking, the sound of our boots on the gravel crunching in the silence between us. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel like something's wrong, like you've stepped into something you don't understand. We didn't talk about it much after that, but I could tell it was bothering Steve just as much as it was bothering me. Neither of us had any idea what we'd found out there, but it didn't feel right. We didn't tell anyone about the ring of stones, the bones, or the feathers. It felt like something we were supposed to forget, and I think we both knew it. A couple of weeks later, I found myself out in those same woods again. I wasn't with Steve this time. I just needed to get out there again, to see if the memory of what we found would fade or if it would stay with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. I figured I'd just take a short walk, get some air, and clear my head. But when I got to the spot where we'd found the ring of stones, something hit me. The ring was gone. At first, I thought maybe we'd just missed it, but no, it wasn't there. There was no sign of the stones or the bones. The ground looked undisturbed, like no one had been there at all. I searched the area, moving in circles, trying to find anything that might explain it. But nothing. There was no trace of what we'd seen. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe something obvious, like a sign that someone else had been there since we left. But there was nothing. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot, wondering if maybe we had imagined it, if maybe we'd just let our imaginations run wild. But deep down, I knew we hadn't. I don't know what we found that day, and I'm not sure I want to. All I know is that I won't be going back out there again. Some things are meant to be left alone, and sometimes the woods are better left unexplored. I hiked into the Bitterroot Mountains in mid-fall, when the air was crisp and the trees started shedding their leaves in a colorful carpet on the forest floor. It wasn't the first time I'd gone into the backcountry, but something about this trip felt different. Maybe it was the timing, maybe it was the weather, or maybe it was just the feeling that I was truly alone in the wilderness this time. No fellow hikers, no rangers, no sign of civilization for miles. Just me, the trees, and the silence. I had been planning this solo trip for a while. 4 days, 3 nights, a loop through some of the quieter parts of the Bitterroots. I wanted to be off the grid, far from the noise of daily life, and at that time of year, I knew there wouldn't be many others around. The forest was beginning to strip itself of summer's warmth. The ground was starting to chill, and I had no plans to rush. This was supposed to be a peaceful trip, a chance to clear my head and reset. I didn't expect anything unsettling to happen, and in the back of my mind, I figured I'd be back at my truck in a few days with a bunch of pictures and memories to share. I set up camp on the first night at a small clearing beside a stream. The air was cold, but the fire crackled in my camp stove as I boiled water for a meal. As the sun set and the sky turned from pinks and oranges to the deep blues of twilight, the forest around me seemed to settle into its usual quiet. I could hear the trickling of the stream, the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind, and the faint sounds of birds roosting for the night. It was exactly what I was hoping for. But then, just as I was finishing my meal, I heard something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It started as a scream, high-pitched, human, but distorted. It echoed through the trees, bouncing off the cliffs and ridges surrounding the valley. The scream lasted for maybe 30 seconds. It sounded like someone was in pain, desperate, hurt, or maybe even in terror. The pitch wavered in such a way that I couldn't place it. Was it a person? A wild animal? I didn't know, but it didn't feel right. Not at all. I froze, listening intently. The world around me suddenly felt too still. The rustling of the leaves, the soft gurgle of the stream, all of it disappeared. My heart raced, but I didn't move. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a coyote or something else that could mimic human sounds. The Bitterroots weren't exactly known for its high population of people, but it was still possible. It had to be. I waited for a few minutes, straining my ears for any movement. The silence stretched on. Then, just when I thought I might have imagined it, the scream came again, this time much closer. My body went rigid. It sounded like it was coming from deeper in the woods, maybe a few hundred yards away. I couldn't tell where, though. The scream wasn't just a distant noise anymore. It was right there, looming. It echoed off the trees, twisting around in a way that made it hard to pinpoint. But there was no mistaking it. It was human, unmistakably so, but stretched and warped in a way that made it feel unnatural. My first instinct was to grab my bear spray, which I kept at hand just for moments like this, but I forced myself to stay still. My mind raced. What if it wasn't just an animal? What if it was someone in trouble? But that didn't make sense either. If someone was that close, I should have heard them moving through the underbrush. I should have heard footsteps. But there was nothing but the scream, just the scream, and then the cold, suffocating silence that followed. I felt a twinge of panic. I'd spent enough time in the wilderness to know the rule. Don't go towards strange sounds, especially at night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. Couldn't ignore it. I had to know if someone was in trouble. I grabbed my headlamp and my bear spray, keeping it close, and stood up. My movements were slow, deliberate. There was a part of me telling me to leave, to pack up my gear and head straight back to the truck. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. I waited a little longer, listening carefully. But the forest remained eerily quiet after the second scream. No more rustling in the bushes. No more echoing voices. I looked around, scanning the tree line, but nothing was moving. It felt as if the entire world had paused, holding its breath. As I stood there, a third scream pierced the night. This time it was closer, much closer. And that was the point where I finally felt that primal, gut-deep sense of fear that only comes when you realize you might not be alone. I didn't move, but my mind raced. That scream didn't sound like an animal anymore. It was too human, too full of desperation, but too off. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was out there. The only question was what, and whether it was getting closer. I stayed still for a long time, clutching my bear spray like a lifeline, my flashlight now scanning the darkness. The only thing I could hear was the pounding of my heart. The wind had died down, and the forest was still as stone. I knew that bears, mountain lions, and other predators often make strange noises, but this felt different, felt wrong. After what felt like hours, I finally exhaled, realizing my muscles had been locked up tight. My mind was playing tricks on me. I had to remind myself it could be an animal. I had to, but the scream, God, it was too real, too human. I could hear my own breathing now. I had to stay calm. I checked my gear again, ensuring everything was in place. The fire was just a few feet away, and the faint orange glow flickered in the distance. I considered heading back to my tent, but the thought of lying down in that silence, knowing that scream was out there somewhere, made my skin crawl. I couldn't do it. Not yet. Instead, I waited and waited. My watch told me an hour had passed since the last scream. Maybe two. The forest still hadn't come back to life. I sat by the fire for a while, staring into the flames, trying to convince myself that I wasn't in any immediate danger. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something waiting. I eventually decided to call it a night, but not before doing a thorough check of my camp. I made sure everything was secure. My backpack was zipped tight, my food safely packed away in a hanging bag, and my tent was well staked. But even after all of that, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. I climbed into my tent, zipping the door up tight and turning off the headlamp. The darkness enveloped me, and for a while, I lay there, straining to hear the sounds of the forest returning. I wasn't sure how much time passed, but at some point, I drifted off. My mind wasn't entirely at ease, but exhaustion took over. I woke in the middle of the night to total silence. No sounds of animals, no wind, no trickle of the stream, just an oppressive quiet that felt heavy in the air. I lay there wide awake, listening. The scream didn't come again. The rest of the night passed in absolute silence. I don't know how long I stayed awake, but it felt like hours. I was too paranoid to sleep. The next morning, I packed up quickly, double-checking everything as I moved through the motions of breaking camp. The sky was overcast, and the air had a chill to it that made my breath visible in the morning light. I couldn't get out of that spot fast enough. As I made my way back to the trailhead, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. The forest around me seemed even darker in the daylight, and every rustling leaf made me jump. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the forest, where the trees began to thin and the first signs of civilization appeared, that I finally felt like I could breathe again. I never found out what caused the screams. I didn't stick around to figure it out. I can tell myself it was an animal or maybe some bizarre echo of human activity in the woods. But the truth is, I'll never know for sure. The Bitterroots are full of strange noises, animals, and wilderness, but nothing will ever feel as eerie as that night. Whatever it was, I'm just glad I left when I did. I can't explain it. I don't want to, but I'll never go back to that spot again. I was camping off-grid in northern Arizona, alone. There's something peaceful about being deep in the woods, disconnected from the noise of the world. My campsite was tucked into a small clearing, surrounded by thick pines. The sky above was that sharp blue you only get at high altitudes, and the air felt dry but refreshing. No other campers nearby, just the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. I had my shortwave radio with me, one of those old models that runs on batteries. It's not much, but it's something to do while sitting around a campfire, just listening to static or catching bits of conversations from other places. I'd been out there for a couple of days, enjoying the solitude. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains when I settled in for the night. I made a simple dinner, cleaned up, and started a small fire. It wasn't cold, but it felt good to have the flames crackling. I set up my tent a little farther from the fire, my backpack by the entrance. After a while, I reached for my radio, hoping to catch something interesting. It's always a gamble, you never know what you're going to pick up. I turned it on and all I heard was static. That was normal, though. Most of the time, it's just static. I shrugged it off, left it on low, and watched the fire for a while. A few minutes passed, and then it happened. The radio turned itself up. The static was louder now, almost grating. It wasn't the kind of noise that fades into the background. It stood out, filling the silence. I looked at the radio, confused. I hadn't touched it, hadn't moved it. I glanced around the campsite, wondering if maybe a breeze had knocked it or if something had caused the volume dial to turn on its own. But there was no wind. The trees were still. Everything was still. I stood up and walked over to the radio, turning the volume back down and then off completely. My pack was on the ground, and the radio was at the bottom of it, so I figured it might have been a loose connection. I didn't think much of it at the time. 5 minutes later, the radio turned itself on again. Louder this time. The static screeched through the night air like it was trying to claw its way out of the speaker. Felt wrong. The sudden noise jarred me, and for a second, I just stood there, staring at it. My heart started to pick up a little. The radio wasn't near anything that could have triggered it. There wasn't even a breeze. I moved quickly to the pack, this time reaching for the off switch with a little more urgency, turning the dial hard. I set the radio face down on the ground beside my tent, hoping that would end it. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe I was just tired. The isolation sometimes plays tricks on you. I went back to my campfire, but the odd sensation lingered. I kept glancing at the radio, watching for it to move, but nothing happened. Everything seemed normal again. The sound of the crackling fire was almost soothing, and I tried to focus on that, pushing the strange event to the back of my mind. But it wasn't easy. There was something unsettling about the way it had turned on by itself. It didn't feel like a malfunction. It felt deliberate, like someone or something had turned it on. The night stretched on, and I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the radio turning on again, the static rising in the dark. At some point, I decided to just take the batteries out. Maybe that would stop it. I opened the back of the radio and pulled out the AA batteries one by one. I stared at them for a moment, wondering if I was overreacting. I put the radio back in the pack, zipped it up tight, and went to sleep. At some point, I woke up. It was pitch black in the tent, the only light coming from the faint glow of the dying fire outside. I had no idea what time it was, but I felt off. There was a low buzz in the air, almost like a hum that you can't really hear but can feel in your bones. I sat up, suddenly wide awake, my eyes darting around the tent. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. I listened hard, straining to hear anything. That's when I noticed it. A soft, blue glow was coming from my pack. The glow wasn't bright, but it was unmistakable, casting strange shadows on the inside of my tent. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't turned the radio back on. The batteries were out. I knew that for sure. I told myself it was just the moonlight filtering through the trees, but something about it didn't sit right. The glow was too steady, too unnatural. I slid out of my sleeping bag, my hands trembling a little. I moved slowly toward the pack, my mind racing. I reached for the zipper, opened it, and pulled it back. The radio was sitting there, facing up, glowing faintly with that same eerie blue light. It was on. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at it, but everything inside me told me to shut it off again. So I grabbed the radio, turned it off, and shoved it back to the bottom of the pack. The glow immediately stopped. The night felt like it was holding its breath, everything silent again. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the feeling that had crept up behind me. I wasn't alone. I felt it. Something was out there, watching me. I could feel eyes on the back of my neck, a pressure that wasn't there a moment ago. My pulse quickened. I moved carefully, not wanting to make any noise, but everything inside me was telling me to get out of there. The calm, clear night outside now seemed like an open grave. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I packed up as quickly as I could, stuffing my gear into my backpack, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that the radio would turn itself on again at any second. But it didn't. Not that time. I didn't make it far before the unease finally caught up with me. I couldn't stay on edge like that. The radio had spooked me, sure, but something deeper was gnawing at me. I kept walking, but every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves felt like something moving in the darkness. After about an hour, I found a small clearing and decided to set up camp again, hoping that maybe the fresh air would help me clear my mind. I didn't want to be too far from the road, though. I didn't feel safe in the woods anymore. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening for anything out of place. But the radio didn't turn on again. The glow didn't return. The stillness of the forest seemed to stretch on forever, and I couldn't help but wonder if I had imagined everything. By morning, I was ready to leave. I didn't even pack up my tent or camp. I grabbed what I could, threw it in the car, and drove out of the woods. Felt good to be on the road again, where the world felt solid and real. I wasn't sure what had happened out there, but it didn't matter. I didn't plan to go back. The radio, I left it in the car. I didn't even want to touch it again. But a few days later, I noticed something. The glow, faint and blue, coming from the bottom of the bag. I took it out, checked the batteries again. They were fine, still working. The radio wasn't on, but the glow was still there. The thing is, I don't think it's the radio that's the problem. I think it was just a way of getting my attention. Something had been out there in the woods with me. Something I couldn't see, something I couldn't explain. The radio, it wasn't malfunctioning. It was telling me something, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to leave it behind. I had never been the kind of person who got easily spooked. Growing up in the countryside, surrounded by endless woods, I had spent countless hours in forests, wandering trails, getting lost on purpose, and exploring places that probably weren't meant to be explored. But that evening in Utah, something was different. It was a late summer day, and I had decided to take one last walk on the trail before the sun dipped behind the mountains. The trail I was walking was tucked into the rolling hills outside a small town, a quiet place with nothing but open space and dry brush for miles. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, just a peaceful walk to clear my head. I started off around 7:30 p.m., the warm desert air still hanging around as the sun began its slow descent. The light was fading quickly, but I knew the trail well enough. The terrain was mostly flat with a few gentle inclines and dips, nothing too strenuous. I wasn't in a hurry, just enjoying the solitude. The sound of my boots crunching against the dirt and gravel was the only thing that filled the air, aside from the faint hum of insects. As I moved further down the path, I could hear the wind whispering through the sparse trees and the occasional rustle of dry grass. It was peaceful, too peaceful, I thought, as the quiet began to settle into an uncomfortable stillness. And that's when I heard it. At first, it was subtle, just the faintest sound, like something moving behind me. I stopped for a second, thinking it might be my imagination, but then I heard it again, soft, rhythmic, like the sound of a dog padding along the trail, its paws scraping against the dirt. I turned quickly, scanning the empty path behind me. There was nothing there, just the dusty trail stretching behind me, disappearing into the fading sunlight. I stood still for a moment, my breath catching in my chest, unsure of what I had just heard. It wasn't unusual to see wildlife on the trails here. Foxes, coyotes, or even the occasional mountain lion. But the sound of a dog, in the middle of nowhere with no one around, that didn't make sense. I took a deep breath and shook it off, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me. Maybe a rabbit scurrying in the brush, or a distant coyote, I told myself. I took a few more steps forward, but the sound followed. The steady pad of paws, the sharpness of breath. It was there, just behind me, unmistakable. It was close, but still nothing visible. I turned again, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever animal was making the noise. But again, there was nothing. I felt my heart rate pick up, but I forced myself to continue walking. It was probably a dog, I thought. Someone's dog that had somehow slipped away from its owner and was following me. I tried to rationalize it, but deep down, I knew something didn't feel right. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and it wasn't stopping. My steps quickened, and with each pace, I heard the soft padding of paws getting closer, closer. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. It was as though something invisible was walking just a few feet behind me, breathing, following my every move. It stopped when I stopped. Every time I slowed, I could hear the breathing grow softer, then catch up to me again when I started walking faster. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that whatever was back there wasn't just a dog. I picked up the pace, almost jogging now. The sound of the invisible dog seemed to match my speed, as if it were matching my every move. I didn't know why I was so scared. It was just a dog, right? But I felt a knot in my stomach, a coldness creeping up my spine. I was alone in the middle of nowhere with no one around for miles. As I moved faster, I began to notice something odd. The sounds weren't fading. They were still there, just behind me. The breathing, the paw steps, the presence. It wasn't an animal, not in any way that made sense. It wasn't a stray dog. Whatever was following me wasn't acting like any animal I knew. It was more deliberate, more persistent, like it was aware of me. By now, I was practically running. The trail stretched out ahead of me, the hills darkening as the last of the sunlight bled into the horizon. But no matter how fast I moved, it stayed with me. An invisible, persistent companion. I could hear the air shifting with each breath it took. I could feel its presence behind me like the weight of something lurking just out of sight. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I froze. The sudden silence was deafening. No paw steps, no breathing, nothing. For a moment, I just stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and see what it was, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. There was no rational explanation for what I had just experienced. I took another step forward. The silence stretched on. No sound, no presence. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally began walking again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Something was still there, just beyond the edge of my awareness. My mind raced, trying to justify what had happened. A hallucination? An animal I had never seen before? I didn't know, but the unease in my stomach only grew stronger. The last half-mile of the trail was mostly downhill, and I hurried through it. The faster I walked, the more convinced I was that I wasn't imagining the sounds. They had been real, but I still couldn't explain them. The invisible dog, the breath, the feeling of being stalked. It had all been too real. When I finally reached my truck, I practically ran the last few feet to the parking lot, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I couldn't get the door open fast enough. I threw my pack in the back, slammed the tailgate down, and jumped into the driver's seat. My heart was still racing, and I was trying to calm myself down, to make sense of what had happened. But then I saw them. Fresh dog prints imprinted in the dust on the tailgate. I froze, staring at the prints. The dirt was soft, undisturbed except for the perfect outline of a dog's paws. One set, just one set. It wasn't possible. I hadn't seen any dog on the trail, and yet, there they were, clear as day, right on my truck, as if it had walked right up to it while I was inside. I couldn't explain it. I didn't even want to. The feeling of something watching me still hadn't gone away, and I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of the prints on the truck or the eerie, inexplicable presence that had followed me all the way back to it. I drove out of the lot as fast as I could, my mind a blur of confusion and fear. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something behind me, but there was nothing. The road stretched on, empty and quiet. When I got back to town, I parked my truck in a well-lit area and checked the tailgate again, just to make sure I hadn't imagined the prints. They were still there, unchanged. I didn't go back to the trail. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't make sense of it. I didn't want to admit that something had followed me, something I couldn't see or touch. I still think about that evening. I can't explain it, and part of me doesn't want to. But every time I pass that trail now, every time I look at my truck, I remember the prints. And I wonder who or what had been following me that day, and why did it leave its mark? The memory still sits with me like a weight, something I can't shake, something that reminds me that the world, even in its quietest moments, holds more mysteries than we're ever prepared to face. It was early in the morning when I first noticed the faint trail, barely visible through the underbrush. The sun had just begun to creep over the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I'd been hiking the Ozarks for a couple of days, following marked trails with the occasional side trip to stretch my legs. But this one was different. It wasn't on any of the maps I had, and I was pretty sure I hadn't seen it listed on any guide I'd come across. The trail was barely more than a series of worn patches in the leaves, almost hidden by the thick brush and overgrown ferns. It looked old, too old to be a recent path, and I guessed it might be from hunters or maybe old logging roads that hadn't seen use in years. It curved through the trees, the kind of trail that teases you to follow it deeper, promising that it might lead to something interesting, or at least something new. I checked my GPS briefly. The main trail, a larger route I'd been following, was nearby, so I knew I wouldn't get lost if I turned back. I debated for a moment, but then decided to take the chance. I'd always been the type to follow a path, especially if it seemed like it had a story to tell. As I stepped off the main trail and onto the faded one, the world around me seemed to quiet down. The sounds of birds, insects, and distant animal calls began to fade. It was a strange shift, almost like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. But that was probably just my imagination. The path became steeper as I descended into a hollow. The ground beneath my feet was soft, wet from the morning dew, and the air grew thicker with the smell of earth and rotting leaves. The trees crowded closer together, their trunks twisted and gnarly, stretching their limbs over the trail like they were trying to keep you from seeing too far ahead. It was hard to shake the feeling that this was a place that wasn't meant to be walked through, a place that wasn't made for humans. I kept moving forward, pushing through thick patches of underbrush that tugged at my clothes. The path grew narrower, and the ground became uneven. I was starting to realize that I might have misjudged the whole thing. The steepness was making it harder to navigate, and the trail didn't seem like it had been traveled in a long time. No one had passed this way recently, that much was clear. Eventually, the trail narrowed to nothing more than a few dead leaves scattered on the ground. I couldn't see where it ended, but the dense forest pressed in from all sides, and I realized there wasn't a single clearing or space large enough to set up camp. Just the trees, the dirt, and the silence. I stood there for a moment, staring into the thick woods. There was something unsettling about how still it was. Even the birds seemed to have stopped chirping. I turned around, intending to head back to the main trail, but when I looked around, I realized something was off. I didn't recognize any of the landmarks. The trees looked the same as they had before, but nothing felt familiar anymore. The hollow had swallowed me up, and I wasn't sure which direction was which. I pulled out my GPS and checked it again. It said I was still on the main trail, that I hadn't veered off. But that didn't make sense. The landscape around me was unfamiliar. The trees, the rocks, the way the slope curved, nothing matched what I had seen earlier in the day. I stood still, trying to make sense of it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I spent a few minutes trying to get my bearings, but I only seemed to get more lost. I walked for what felt like hours, looking for any marker, any sign of the trail I had been following. But the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. The trees seemed to change shape, and the landscape around me kept shifting, as if the forest was playing tricks on my mind. I checked my GPS again, but it still said I was on the main trail. That couldn't be true. I was sure I was no longer where I had started. The trail had completely disappeared, and I was left in a place that felt like it didn't belong. The sun was high in the sky now, but it didn't feel like it. The trees above me blocked most of the light, casting everything into a kind of shadowy twilight. The air had grown thick, heavy, and every step felt like it took more effort than the last. My clothes were sticking to me with sweat, and I was starting to feel the weight of panic creeping in. I decided to head uphill, hoping that if I could get to a higher vantage point, I'd be able to see something familiar. But as I pushed my way through the undergrowth, I kept running into dead ends, fallen logs, thick vines, and dense patches of brush that seemed to grow thicker with each step. Every time I thought I'd made progress, I'd end up right back where I started. I wasn't sure how much time had passed. Hours? Maybe more? The sun's position had shifted, but everything still looked the same. I could feel the panic building in my chest, and I kept telling myself that I just needed to calm down and focus. There had to be a way out. It wasn't like the forest had just closed up on me. I forced myself to take a deep breath, wiping the sweat from my brow. I looked around again, trying to find something that would tell me where I was. The landscape seemed to mock me. Nothing looked familiar. I was no longer sure if I had been walking in circles or if the forest had just gotten impossibly bigger. At one point, I thought I heard something behind me. The sound was faint, like footsteps, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. I stared into the woods for a long time, feeling like I was being watched, but there was no movement, just the quiet. The unease I'd felt earlier in the day had turned into full-blown anxiety. I kept checking my GPS, but it wasn't helping. It was saying I was still on the main trail, but I knew that was a lie. I had to be somewhere else. I had no choice but to keep going. I couldn't stay here forever, and I was determined to find a way out. The longer I walked, the more disoriented I became. My feet were sore, my legs heavy, and the feeling of dread never seemed to leave. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep this up. And then, just as I was beginning to lose hope, I saw it, clearing up ahead. It wasn't much, just a small space, but it looked like something I could use to get my bearings. I pushed my way through the last bit of brush and stepped into the clearing. I froze. The sight before me was something I couldn't explain. There was a rock outcropping on the far side, one that I didn't recognize, and there was a pile of branches stacked in the center of the clearing. They looked like they'd been placed there intentionally, but the strange thing was how they were arranged. The branches weren't random. They were stacked in a way that looked almost deliberate. Felt wrong, like someone had been here recently. I approached cautiously, scanning the area around me. The silence was oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But there was nothing there. No animals, no sounds, just the eerie stillness. I decided to take a chance. I had to keep moving. I stepped back into the trees, continuing to climb uphill, hoping this time I would find something that made sense. It took hours, but finally, I began to recognize some of the landscape. The slope began to flatten out, and the trees thinned a little. Eventually, I reached a ridge, and from there, I could see the main trail again. It wasn't far off, but it felt like a lifetime had passed since I had seen it. I made my way toward the trail and found it exactly where I had left it. The feeling of relief was overwhelming, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the questions in my mind. Where had I been? Why hadn't my GPS worked? How had I gotten so lost in a place I thought I knew? I didn't have answers, but I knew one thing. I would never take that trail again. The forest in the Ozarks is a strange place, and I'm not sure I'll ever fully understand what happened that day. But I learned something important. The woods can be disorienting, and sometimes, even when you think you know where you're going, it can take hours, days, or even longer to find your way out again. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to shake the feeling that there was something out there, something that had been watching me the whole time. The deep Sierras, a place most people can only dream of visiting, and a place where you can forget about the world. I'd been there a couple of times before with friends, but this time we went in a little deeper. It was a group of us, all of us itching for a bit of time away from everything, work, social media, and yeah, all the noise. No signal, no people for miles, just stars and the sounds of the wilderness. We drove up as far as we could and then hiked in, carrying everything we'd need for the next few days. We were looking to make camp by a creek we knew about, one that wasn't on the usual maps. The hike was exhausting, but the further in we went, the more we felt like we were escaping. By the time we set up camp, the sun had dipped behind the peaks, and the temperature was already dropping. We settled in for a night of whiskey, stories, and a quiet fire crackling beside us. Felt like nothing could touch us out here. The first night passed without incident. We sat around the fire until it died down, then turned in for sleep. The sound of the night felt distant and peaceful. You know, the kind of quiet that's only found when you're miles from the nearest town. The kind of quiet that makes you realize just how loud the world is most of the time. The second night, things took a strange turn. We just finished our dinner and were cleaning up when one of my buddies, Jake, stood up suddenly, squinting at something in the trees. He pointed and we all followed his gaze. In the distance, a red light blinked once, then twice. It wasn't like a flashlight or anything you'd expect to see in the woods, though. It was almost rhythmic, blinking in a pattern. At first, we all thought it was some kind of drone. A lot of people have them these days, and it wouldn't be too strange for someone to be out here with one, right? The Sierras weren't exactly a tourist hotspot, but still, people sometimes hiked or camped here. We joked around, saying maybe it was some lost tech geek trying to get a shot of the stars. Still, something didn't feel quite right about it. It was too far in, too deep, for someone to be casually out there with a drone. Jake didn't let it go, though. He stared at the blinking red light for what seemed like forever, not saying much. We shrugged it off, convinced it was just a one-off thing. No harm, no foul. That night, we went to bed, but the light lingered in the back of my mind. It just felt off. On the third night, it was back, and closer. This time, it wasn't just a blink in the distance. We could see the red light more clearly now, even from our campfire. It was almost like it was hovering, suspended in the trees, just a little too high for us to get a good look at. We all exchanged uneasy glances. None of us had brought anything like that with us. None of us had any drones or tech that could do something like that. Who would be out there with a drone in the middle of nowhere? I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just some weird trick of the light, maybe an animal's eyes reflecting something. But it didn't feel like that. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I kept hearing the sound of something small moving in the underbrush, but I told myself it was just a deer or a raccoon. Nothing serious. The others were feeling it too, I could tell, but no one wanted to voice it. I woke up in the middle of the night. I'm not sure what woke me, but I heard it. A soft whirring sound. It wasn't loud, but it was there, hovering just at the edge of my hearing. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe some critter in the trees, but the more I listened, the more I realized it was something mechanical. A hum, almost like an engine, but quieter, more subtle. I tried to stay still, straining my ears in the dark, listening for it again. My eyes adjusted to the dim light from the stars, and I glanced around the camp. Everyone else was asleep, seemingly unaware, but that whirring sound didn't stop. I'd heard it before, but this time it was closer. It was so soft, almost like a drone, but without the same buzz. It was almost like it was deliberately staying quiet, like it didn't want to be heard. I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. I lay there, frozen, listening to the soft mechanical hum. I felt like something was out there, watching us, but I couldn't explain why. I wanted to go check it out, but I didn't want to risk going into the dark alone, not with the feeling that something wasn't right. And there was no way I was going to wake anyone up to search for a sound that could just be the wind. But the sound was there, and it didn't stop. By the time first light came, I had barely slept. I didn't want to say anything to the others right away. Not yet. We were packing up, getting ready to head out, but my mind was racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something had been out there the whole time, just out of sight. As we made our way back down the trail, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. The Sierras, beautiful as they were, suddenly felt more like a trap. The peace I'd felt coming in was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of unease. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that we had just gotten caught up in our own heads, but it didn't feel like that. I couldn't explain the red light, or the soft whirring sound, or the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the edge of the trees. The more I thought about it, the less I could make sense of it. The only thing I knew for sure was that I wasn't coming back. At least not like that. Not without understanding what the hell had happened. None of us spoke about it again, not on the way out. No one wanted to voice the thought we all shared, that there was something in those woods. We all felt it, and whatever it was smarter than us. We made it out and back to the car by mid-morning, all of us jumpy, glancing at the shadows like we expected something to jump out. The road back felt longer than it should have, as if the trees and mountains were closing in on us. I haven't been back since. I don't know what we saw or heard. I don't know if it was a drone or something else entirely, but I do know this. Something was out there with us. And next time, if I ever go back, I'll make sure we're not alone. I had planned for a quiet, peaceful hike, one of the last of the season. The kind where the trees were bare, and the frost still clung to everything, even though it was well past morning. Late fall had settled in, and the air felt heavy with the cold. The kind of cold that sticks to your bones no matter how many layers you put on. A few hours into the hike, I came across a small, bubbling stream. The water was running clear, but the stones along its edge were slick with ice, and the ground felt like it might freeze over at any moment. I stopped to drink, squatting near the bank, and pulled off my gloves, letting the cold air bite at my fingers. I dipped my water bottle into the stream, the chill of the water making my fingers go numb. I looked around. The trees were tall and skeletal against the gray sky, and there was a strange, almost eerie stillness to the place. The wind didn't rustle the branches much, and the sound of the water trickling over rocks was the only thing that seemed alive. I filled the bottle and then glanced down at the rock next to me. It was a large stone, partially covered in frost, but something caught my eye. A handprint. I froze. It wasn't like any handprint I had ever seen. It was a bare handprint, no glove, no sign of anything else. Just a hand, pressed down flat on the rock. The fingers were spread wide, as if someone had placed their hand there carefully, but the weirdest part was the way it looked. The edges of the print were clearly defined, but the center, it was as if the hand had been dragged slowly, a streak that extended from the print, as though someone had let their hand slide down the rock in a slow, deliberate motion. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The print was fresh, no mistaking it. It hadn't been there long. There was no frost building up around it yet. No other marks around the stone, no footprints in the mud, not a single sign of anyone else being there. Nothing to explain how a handprint appeared so suddenly, so perfectly placed. I looked around again, feeling suddenly small and exposed. The trees stood like silent sentinels, unmoving and cold. My breath came out in visible clouds, and I tried to calm myself. Probably just someone else on the trail, I told myself, but the thought felt hollow. Something about it felt off. I stepped back from the stream, still staring at the print, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I was sure I was alone. There hadn't been any signs of anyone else on the trail. No other footprints, no fresh tracks in the leaves. But there was something wrong. It was the kind of feeling you get when your instincts are screaming at you, but you can't put your finger on why. I took a few cautious steps back, my eyes glued to the print, and I scanned the area once more. Nothing moved. It was just me, the cold, and that damn handprint. I turned and started walking back up the trail, quickening my pace, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something was just out of sight, waiting. The path was familiar, nothing too steep, just a steady incline through the woods. But it felt different now. The trees felt too close, the shadows stretching longer as the day began to fade. I kept my head down, my thoughts racing. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. People hike in these woods all the time, right? Maybe someone had stopped for a drink earlier. Maybe it was just a hiker who slipped. But no, there was no one else. No tracks. Nothing. Just that print, the smear. My thoughts kept bouncing back to that smear. Why had someone dragged their hand down the rock like that? If they had just touched it and walked away, that would have been one thing. But the smear, the slow, deliberate motion, it didn't make sense. It was like someone was trying to leave a mark, but they didn't want to be noticed, like they were hiding or worse, waiting. I kept moving, but my pace had picked up. I didn't want to be out here anymore, didn't want to think about that handprint any longer. The sky above was darkening fast, and the cold was seeping into my bones even more with every step. The trail seemed longer now, and the shadows felt deeper, like they were closing in around me. I pulled my jacket tighter, wishing I hadn't forgotten my flashlight. I reached a small clearing, one that opened up into a grove of trees. The air felt thinner here, and the silence was almost deafening. As I stepped forward, something caught my foot, and I stumbled slightly. I put my hand down to steady myself and felt the cold ground beneath my fingers. When I pulled my hand up, I froze. There, on the ground, right where I had just placed my hand, was another print. A handprint. It was fresh, too, just like the one at the stream. Same size, same shape, but this one was on the ground, pressed into the frost-covered earth. No glove, no sign of anyone else. Just a bare handprint with the same faint drag mark running down from the center. My heart hammered in my chest, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. My instincts were screaming at me now, louder than ever. I wasn't alone. Someone was here, but who and why? I looked around again, but nothing moved. No rustling in the trees, no footfalls behind me, just silence. I took a few steps back, my hands shaking as I fumbled with my backpack. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. Maybe my phone, maybe something to defend myself with, but all I could think about was getting out of here. I needed to leave. And then, from somewhere behind me, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible noise. A faint crack of a branch breaking. My blood ran cold. I froze, my breath coming in sharp gasps as I scanned the area around me. Nothing moved. I was alone, but I could feel something, or someone, watching me. I could almost hear the quiet breath of someone just out of sight, the faintest hint of a presence in the air. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to look, but I had no choice. Slowly, I turned my head, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. There was nothing there, just trees. The same empty woods I'd been walking through for hours. But the feeling didn't go away. That prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the sense that someone or something was waiting, lurking just out of sight. I took a few more steps backward, then turned and broke into a jog. I didn't care anymore if I tripped or made noise. I just wanted to get out of the woods, back to where there were people, where I wasn't alone. The path seemed longer now, every twist and turn more confusing, like the woods were trying to disorient me. I didn't look behind me, couldn't bring myself to, but every few seconds, I thought I could hear something in the distance. Footsteps, branches snapping. Whatever it was following me. But when I glanced over my shoulder, nothing was there. I reached the point where the trail split, and I didn't even hesitate. I took the path that led back to the parking lot. I didn't want to go the other way, the way that took me deeper into the woods. I didn't care if it was a longer walk back. I just wanted out. My heart was still racing when I reached the parking lot. I didn't stop until I was in my car, door locked, windows rolled up. I sat there for a moment, just trying to catch my breath. The woods outside seemed so calm, so quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had never been so sure in my life that I wasn't alone out there. The handprints, the smear, the noise I thought I'd heard. It all felt like something I would never be able to explain. There were no other footprints, no sign of anyone else. But I knew, deep down, that I wasn't just imagining it. Something had been following me in those woods. I've gone back to that trail since. It's been months, but I haven't seen any handprints, no strange marks in the frost. The air doesn't feel quite as heavy as it did that day, and the woods don't seem as dark. But every time I walk past that stream, I can't help but glance at the rocks. And every time I hear a twig snap behind me, I feel that same sense of unease creep up my spine. I don't know who or what was out there with me that day. I can't explain the handprints or the strange feeling that never left me. But I know this, there's something in those woods. Something that doesn't want to be found. And something I'm sure will always be waiting out there for whoever dares to venture too far. had been planning the solo trip for months, looking at maps of northern Maine, researching the terrain, and making sure I had everything I needed. It wasn't the longest of trips, just 2 nights in the woods, but I wanted to experience solitude, to be alone with my thoughts and the forest. I'd done solo camping before, but this time felt different. This time, I was in a remote stretch of forest I'd never been to before, far from the nearest road and well off the beaten path. I set off late in the afternoon, the sun still high in the sky, knowing I would have plenty of time to get set up. The woods in northern Maine are dense, thick with pine, fir, and spruce trees. The air smells different here, rich with earth and resin. There's a quiet to the place, one that presses against you. It's not empty, but it feels like it could be. There are no nearby towns, no trailheads teeming with hikers. It's just forest and whatever wildlife happens to call it home. I hiked for a few hours, following a trail that was barely a path at all. There was a creek I crossed once or twice, its clear waters running over smooth rocks, the sound of it calm and soothing. Eventually, I found a small clearing beside a thick stand of evergreens, perfect for my tent. I set up camp without a second thought. It had been a long day, and the sky was turning that golden-orange color, the first signs of evening setting in. By the time my tent was up, the sun was low, and I knew I had a little while before darkness would fall. I started a small fire, just big enough to cook my dinner, but not too large to draw attention. There's something about the isolation in northern Maine that makes you mindful of the smallest things, especially at night. The last thing you want is to attract attention from anything or anyone who might be out there. But there was no one here, right? Just me and the woods. I ate my meal, a simple freeze-dried dinner, and spent the rest of the evening sitting by the fire. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The usual nighttime sounds weren't there. No owls hooting in the distance, no wind rustling the leaves, not even the sound of small creatures moving through the underbrush. Felt almost wrong. I kept looking into the trees, trying to catch a glimpse of something, anything, but there was nothing. The fire crackled and popped, but it felt like the only sound in a void. I stayed up until the fire was little more than glowing embers, the chill of the night settling in around me. I didn't feel scared, exactly, but there was this tension, like I wasn't alone, like the forest was watching me. I finally crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and settled into my sleeping bag, trying to shake off the odd feeling that had settled in my chest. It wasn't long before I fell asleep, though I woke up in the middle of the night. My eyes snapped open in the dark, and for a moment, I had no idea why. Then I heard something. It was faint, but there. A sound of something shifting in the woods, just outside my tent. I listened intently, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound stopped, and I strained to hear anything else. But there was only the soft rustling of leaves in the distance. I told myself it was just a deer or some other animal moving through the woods. I had a knife within arm's reach, my flashlight tucked neatly in the pocket of my bag. If it was anything that might pose a threat, I'd be ready. But I never heard anything more. The night dragged on, but I finally drifted back to sleep. Morning came too quickly, the early sunlight breaking through the trees and casting long shadows around my tent. I unzipped the door and stepped outside, stretching my stiff muscles. The air was crisp, the earth still cool beneath my boots. I walked around the camp, checking my gear, making sure everything was in place. That's when I saw it. A small rock cairn, sitting just a few feet from the edge of my tent. It wasn't huge, just a few rocks stacked together in a rough triangle. I didn't think much of it at first. It seemed like the kind of thing people do to mark a trail or perhaps leave behind as a sign they were there. There were no footprints nearby, and nothing in the area looked disturbed, so it didn't seem like anyone had been around recently. Still, I felt a slight unease stir in my stomach. I spent the rest of the morning packing up my things, taking my time. The cairn was still there when I left, and I made a mental note to keep an eye out as I hiked the next day. I hiked deeper into the woods that afternoon, exploring the area around me. The forest was thick, but the trail was clear, or at least I thought it was. I didn't wander too far, staying within the general area I had marked the previous day. When I returned to camp that evening, the cairn was gone. It didn't make sense. It wasn't like I had missed it. There was no way I had left without seeing it. But now it was simply gone, as if it had never been there. I tried to shake off the creeping discomfort that gnawed at me. The rest of the evening was uneventful, with nothing more than the usual sounds of the forest. It was colder than the night before, and I bundled myself up in my sleeping bag a little earlier, trying to get some rest before the following day's hike. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking about that cairn. Who had made it, and why had it disappeared? The second night in the woods was unsettling. The quiet was louder, the kind of silence that feels too thick. The night stretched on in an unbroken stillness, and I found myself glancing toward the trees more than once, half expecting to see someone watching me. But there was nothing, just the dark forest, the flickering firelight, and me, alone. Then, just before I was about to turn in for the night, I saw something, or more accurately, I noticed something. Just on the edge of my campsite, maybe 20 feet from the tent, was another rock cairn. This one was smaller than the first, a much more rough-hewn thing. It looked like it had been placed there deliberately, but it was closer to my tent, much closer than the last one had been. Felt wrong. Too close. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up, knife in hand, listening to the forest around me. The air was still, and I couldn't hear a thing. Not a single animal or breeze moving through the trees. It was unnervingly quiet, and I kept my eyes fixed on the cairn. I don't know how long I sat there, the knife cold in my hand, but I didn't dare take my eyes off it. I was sure I heard something out there, just beyond the trees. A footstep, maybe, a rustle of leaves. But when I looked, there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the eerie calm of the woods. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just some other camper, some hiker who had passed through earlier and marked their way with a cairn. Maybe they had come back later in the day and added a smaller one, trying to keep track of where they'd been. But something didn't add up. Why had the first cairn disappeared, and why had the second one been placed so close to my tent? It felt intentional, like someone was watching me, like they were trying to get closer. The night stretched on, but I didn't hear anything more. The cairn remained, its rough stones staring back at me. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe someone to come into the clearing, maybe something to happen. But nothing did. The hours passed, and eventually, I found myself too tired to stay awake anymore. I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tightly, and lay there in the dark. The second cairn, just outside the door, kept me awake, kept me alert, but I didn't hear anything more. When the sun finally started to rise, I wasted no time packing up. There was no breakfast, no time to relax. I wanted out of there. I broke down my tent as quickly as I could, packed up my gear, and left without a second glance at the cairn. I didn't want to stay there a moment longer. I made my way back to the trailhead, my legs stiff from the long hike, but I didn't stop to rest. As I walked, I glanced over my shoulder now and then, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was no one, just the quiet of the forest, and me, alone but relieved. When I reached my car, I didn't feel the sense of satisfaction I thought I would. Instead, I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to drive as far from that place as I could, as quickly as I could. I didn't know who had made the cairns or why they had left them there. I didn't know if it had been a person or something else entirely, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going back. The woods in northern Maine had their secrets, and I wasn't eager to uncover them. Some places, some things are better left unexplored. I learned that on that trip, and I made a silent promise to myself that I wouldn't be back. Not anytime soon. Not ever. Camped alone in the Olympic rainforest. Around midnight, I started hearing giggling, like a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old. I thought maybe I was losing it, but it kept going. Not playful, just wrong. Too close, too rhythmic. I got out of my tent and called out. Dead silence. Not even insects. I packed up at 2 a.m. and hiked the hell out under moonlight. I didn't stop until sunrise. That was what I wrote down in my notebook right after I got out, sitting at a diner 2 towns over with a mug of bad coffee and hands still shaking. I've tried to forget it 100 times since then, tried to brush it off like I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me. But it's never left me. It still wakes me up some nights, especially when I hear laughter in dreams. Here's what really happened, in as much detail as I can manage. I planned the trip for weeks. I'd taken a few days off work, packed my gear, got my permits, and checked the forecast over and over. I wanted solitude, not the kind you get at a campsite where you can hear some guy 2 tents over snoring. I mean real solitude, deep woods, no service, no voices but my own. The whole rainforest seemed perfect. Old-growth trees, soft moss underfoot, the endless whisper of dripping leaves. I'd hiked there once before with a group, but this time I wanted to be alone. I parked at the trailhead early in the morning, just after sunrise. It was mid-September, cool but not cold, the kind of damp chill that clings to your sleeves but feels fresh in your lungs. I strapped on my pack and started walking. The trail was slick from rain the night before, the kind of wet that stays even when the sun's out. It made the ground feel alive in a way. Every step muffled, no hard crunch of gravel or snap of twigs, just the soft squish of earth and the occasional splash of a small puddle. By midday, I'd made it deep enough into the forest that I hadn't seen another soul in hours. That was the point. I'd wanted the kind of quiet that only comes when you're dazed from pavement. My plan wasn't complicated. 1 night out, maybe 2 if I felt like it. I'd brought enough food, gear, and water purification tablets for a few days. I wasn't in a hurry. Around 4 p.m., I found a spot that looked just about perfect. It was flat, surrounded by thick trees and ferns, and just out of sight of the trail. I wanted to be off the path, not right in someone's footsteps. There was a little stream nearby, not much more than a trickle, but enough to filter water. I pitched my tent, unpacked my stove, and made a simple dinner. Ramen and jerky, nothing fancy. It got dark early under that canopy. By 7 p.m., it felt like midnight. I sat out on a log with a small fire going, just enough to keep warm and feel like I had a bit of light against all that darkness pressing in. The sounds of the forest at night are something else. You don't realize how many layers there are until you stop and listen. Wind in the treetops, rain dripping from leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. Sometimes the brush rustles and your mind jumps to bears or cougars, but most of the time it's just a squirrel or something shifting as it settles for the night. I've camped alone plenty before. I know what's normal and what isn't. I turned in around 9 p.m. I'd been reading by headlamp and my eyes were tired. The fire had gone out and I didn't feel like starting it back up. I zipped myself into the sleeping bag, left the rain fly off the tent because the sky had cleared, and tried to let myself drift off to the sound of rain and forest. I must have been asleep for a couple of hours when I first heard it. Laughter, not loud, just a soft giggle, high-pitched. At first I thought I was dreaming, that kind of half-dream where real sounds blend with whatever your brain's making up. But I blinked and realized I was wide awake. Came again 3 short giggles. Exactly the same, like a recording played back. Same pitch, same timing. I lay still for a minute trying to make sense of it. Sound carries weird in the woods, I told myself. Could be an animal. Coyotes sometimes make sounds that almost sound like laughter if you don't know better. But it didn't echo like a coyote call. It didn't fade or rise. It was just there, like it was standing right outside my tent. I waited, heart starting to pound a little. I listened hard, straining to hear any footsteps, any rustling of leaves or crack of twigs. Nothing. Dead still. Then it happened again. The same giggle. 3 short bursts. Exactly the same. I sat up, trying not to make any noise. I clicked off my headlamp so the light wouldn't give me away. My eyes adjusted to the dim moonlight filtering through the trees. The tent's mesh walls gave me a view of the trees around me, pale shapes in the gloom, unmoving. I held my breath, just listening. The giggling didn't come again for a while. Just silence. That kind of silence that's so complete it rings in your ears. I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out slowly. The air was colder than I expected. I looked around, not seeing anything moving. Just trees, the silver outlines of moss-covered trunks, ferns dark against the earth. I said, quietly, "Hello," not shouting, just a simple call. Nothing, no answer, no rustle, no laughter. And that was the part that really got me. It was the quiet, because even the normal forest sounds had stopped. No wind in the branches, no leaves dripping, no insects. Felt like the whole place was holding its breath. I stood out there for maybe 5 minutes, just scanning the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was like something was right out of sight. Not moving, not breathing, just there. Eventually, I went back into the tent, zipped it up, and sat with my back against my pack. I couldn't lie down again. I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel alone. The giggle came again around 1 in the morning. Same tone, same 3 little bursts, this time closer. That was it for me. I didn't care how late it was or how far I was from the trailhead. I wasn't going to stay there another minute. I packed up in a rush, rolled my sleeping bag without folding it right, crammed gear into my pack without checking if it was dry, left the tent poles half attached and just stuffed the whole thing into the side pocket. By 2 a.m., I had everything on my back and was headed out. No fire, no light. I didn't want to draw attention. I used the moonlight filtering through the trees to guide my way. I had a headlamp in my pocket but didn't turn it on until I absolutely had to. I knew the trail twisted and turned, followed the stream at times and veered up and over little ridges. It would be easy to lose my way if I rushed, but I didn't want to stop. I kept checking behind me, every so often, feeling sure I'd see someone or something standing between the trees, but there was never anything, just that tight, dead silence. The trail was harder to follow than I'd expected. The moss blurred the edges, and the wet ground made every step slow. I slipped more than once. Once I fell hard, caught myself with my hand and felt the sting of a cut across my palm. Didn't even stop to bandage it. I just wiped the blood on my pants and kept moving. At one point, maybe around 4 a.m., I paused to drink from a bottle and adjust a strap that had been cutting into my shoulder. I was bent over, fixing it, when I heard a branch crack behind me. Not far, 10 feet, maybe less. I froze, didn't look, didn't breathe, just stood still with every muscle tight. The sound didn't repeat. No footsteps, no laughter. Eventually, I moved on. The moon dipped lower, and the forest got darker. My legs ached. My shoulders burned. I didn't care. I walked faster. I wanted to be out of the trees, where the sky felt like it was closing in. I wanted pavement, noise, people, anything. By sunrise, I reached the trailhead. The sky had just started to glow pale pink and orange, and the parking lot was still empty. My car sat where I left it, mist beating on the windshield. I unlocked it, tossed my gear in the back, and sat in the driver's seat with my hands gripping the wheel like it was a lifeline. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there trying to steady my breathing. My clothes were damp, my feet sore, and my whole body buzzing with the kind of tension that takes hours to drain. I looked back at the tree line one last time. Nothing moved. I didn't go back for the rest of that trip. Drove straight to a diner a few towns away, ordered breakfast I couldn't eat, and sat there for hours watching the door. I didn't sleep until late that night in a motel room with the TV on, volume low, just enough to break the silence. I've told people versions of this story, always trimmed down, made it sound more like a weird night in the woods than what it really was, because I still don't know what it was. No ghost, no monster, no shadow person. Just a sound that shouldn't have been there and a silence that felt wrong. Like the forest was hiding something it didn't want me to see. I've been back to the Olympics since, but not alone. Not deep, and not without checking over my shoulder every few minutes, especially after dark. Because sometimes the woods aren't haunted. Sometimes they're just watching. I was deep in the Smokies when it happened. I'd gotten an early start that morning, hoping to beat the crowds. The air was damp and cold, and even in the early light, everything felt heavy. I'd been hiking solo for a few days, nothing too crazy, just moving through some of the backcountry trails that loop around old logging roads and narrow ridgelines. I wasn't trying to do anything heroic or make big miles. Just walking and camping, getting away from everything. That day, the trail had been quiet. I hadn't seen another soul for hours, maybe even since the day before. The only sounds were my boots on the wet leaves and the occasional drip of water from the trees. Everything was soaked. It had rained the night before, and the forest hadn't dried out. Even the air felt like it was holding its breath. I remember stopping around midday to eat, sitting on a rock that looked out over a hollow. I didn't take long, just a few bites of jerky and a granola bar. Then I kept moving. I wanted to get to a flat section where I knew I could set up for the night. About 2 hours later, the fog rolled in. It didn't come all at once. It was slow. I first noticed it drifting low through the trees below the ridge I was walking on. Then it came up, swallowing the trail behind me and ahead of me. Within 15 minutes, I couldn't see more than 10 feet. Every tree looked like a shadow. The ones further out looked like they were bending toward me. Sounds got strange too, muffled, but also sharper, like everything nearby was whispering. I stopped walking. It felt wrong to keep going. I'm not afraid of fog, not normally. I've hiked in it plenty, but this was thick and dense in a way that didn't feel natural. It had weight to it, like the fog itself was watching. So I stood there on the trail, catching my breath, trying to decide if I should press on or wait it out. That's when I heard the voices. They were faint at first, just little snippets of sound. A man and a woman talking. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I could hear the rhythm. Like one would speak, then the other would reply. I figured they were hikers like me, coming down the trail from the other direction. Maybe they were using GPS or had better maps than I did. So I decided to just step aside and wait. The trail was narrow but had enough space to let someone pass if you hugged the edge. I waited there, leaning on my trekking pole, listening to the voices getting closer. Felt good, even comforting at first. Being alone in the woods is peaceful, but it can get in your head after a while. Hearing other people brought me back a little, reminded me the world was still turning. But then they didn't show up. The voices got louder, clearer. Still a man and a woman. They weren't arguing or anything, just talking like old friends. I could hear words here and there, nothing important. Stuff about walking, something about water, maybe even a joke. But they never came around the bend. I waited longer, 5 minutes, then 10. The voices got close enough I thought I'd see them any second. They sounded like they were just beyond the next cluster of trees, just out of view. I even stepped forward a little, trying to see through the wall of fog. But there was nothing. Then the voices stopped, just like that. 1 second they were there, steady, casual, real, and the next they were gone. Not fading away, not stepping off the trail, just gone. I called out. Just a simple, hey, not loud, not scared. Just enough that if someone was there, they'd answer. Nothing. I listened. Not a footstep, not a reply. Nothing but the fog and the soft sound of a breeze starting to move through the trees. I stayed there, dead still, for what must have been an hour. I checked my watch, though I don't know why. Time moved differently in that fog. I kept thinking I'd hear them again. Maybe they stepped off the trail to pee. Maybe they were resting. Maybe they took a wrong turn. But nothing came. The woods went back to silence. And I started to get that feeling in my stomach. That one you get when something isn't adding up. It wasn't fear, not yet. Just a low hum in my body, telling me something was off. Eventually, the fog started to lift. Not all at once, but enough that I could start to make out the trees farther off. First 20 feet, then 30, then more. The trail ahead of me curved to the left, around a thick clump of rhododendron and mountain laurel. I walked slowly, trying to find footprints. Nothing. The trail was soaked, soft. It should have held prints easily. I checked the ground where I'd been standing and where the voices had seemed to come from. No marks, no scuffs, no sign anyone had walked that trail in hours. That's when I started to feel scared. I kept walking forward, slowly, scanning the ground. Nothing. No broken twigs, no crushed leaves. It was like I'd imagined the whole thing, but I hadn't. I know what I heard. I've spent enough time in the woods to tell the difference between real voices and my mind playing tricks. These weren't echoes or weird animal calls. It was two people talking like they were right there. I kept moving, checking both sides of the trail. I even stepped off into the brush a few times, just to make sure I wasn't missing something. Still nothing. Eventually, I reached a fork, one that wasn't marked on my map. One trail continued straight, the other veered downhill toward a creek. I'd been here before years back, and I remembered taking the left fork down to a flat clearing. I figured that was the best place to camp. I didn't want to keep going uphill into more fog. As I made my way down, the fog cleared completely. The sun was low now, throwing long shadows through the trees. The forest looked normal again. Just woods, just leaves and bark and undergrowth. The feeling of being watched was gone. I set up camp in the clearing, made a small fire enough to keep me company, ate some food, filtered water, checked my map again. Everything lined up. Everything made sense on paper, but I didn't sleep that night. I laid in my sleeping bag, listening to every twig snap, every rustle. I kept thinking about the voices, how clear they were, how close, and how there were no footprints. I left early the next morning, didn't make coffee, didn't eat, just packed up and moved. A couple days later, when I made it back to town, I stopped in a ranger station to report what I'd experienced. Not because I thought it was a crime or anything, just in case someone else heard it too. Maybe a couple had gone missing. Maybe there was some logical reason. I told the ranger what trail I was on, what time of day, how long I waited. He listened, nodded, wrote a few things down. Then he said, real quiet, "We get that kind of report from time to time." I asked him what he meant. He just shrugged, said people hear things out there. Sound travels weird in the fog. Sometimes things carry from miles away. Sometimes people imagine things. But I know what I heard. And there's something else, something I didn't tell the ranger. That night in the clearing, just before I crawled into my sleeping bag, I walked a wide circle around my camp, just checking the perimeter. I always do that. Keeps the animals away. Makes me feel better. About 30 feet from my tent, on the far side of a log, I found a pile of stones, stacked carefully. Not big stones, not heavy. Just 5 or 6, balanced one on top of the other. I didn't touch it, didn't take a picture, just stared at it, heart hammering. That pile hadn't been there when I set up camp. I'm sure of it. I would have noticed. I'm always scanning the ground for flat spots and hazards. That log had caught my eye earlier because of the moss growing on it. It wasn't a grave or anything, nothing creepy on its own. But in the middle of the Smokies, in a foggy forest, after hearing voices that never showed up, it was enough. I walked away from it, went back to my tent, zipped it shut, and kept my head down until morning. I don't know what happened that day. Maybe it was some hikers messing around. Maybe it was sound bouncing strangely through the fog. Maybe it was just coincidence. But I've hiked that trail again since then. Same time of year, same route. I never heard the voices again. And the pile of stones wasn't there either. Whatever happened that day, it was one time. But it stays with me, not as a ghost story, not as some supernatural tale, just as a reminder that even in places we know, where everything seems clear and mapped and safe, there are still moments that don't make sense. And in the woods, when something doesn't make sense, you listen, you pay attention, and you don't make the mistake of thinking you know everything, because the forest doesn't care what you believe. It just is, quiet, old, and full of things that don't explain themselves. I was deep in the woods, further than most people go. It was a long weekend and I wanted to get away from everything. People, noise, my phone buzzing nonstop. Just silence, trees, and my own thoughts. I had picked a trail I knew was barely maintained anymore. Something from an old forest map that hadn't been updated in years. About 6 miles in, the trail started to fade, and another mile after that, it was gone. Just underbrush, scattered rocks, and endless trees. That's where I decided to camp. It had rained for 2 days before I got out there. The ground was soaked, the air still heavy. Everything felt like it had just been washed, but not clean, just damp and tired. I picked a small rise, surrounded by thick trees, and set up my tarp. I don't use a tent when I'm solo. Too much weight, just a tarp and bivy bag. I was setting things up when I noticed a break in the tree line off to the left, maybe 30 yards away. Not a clearing exactly, but the brush looked different. Flatter, like it had been pressed down. Curious, I walked over. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Wet nylon, old smoke, and something else. Something like wet plastic and metal. I stepped through a patch of ferns and stopped. Right there, in the middle of the forest, was a tent. It was olive green, military style, 2-person size. Looked old, like it had been through a few seasons. The fly was up, the door zipped shut. Beside it was a fire ring with half-burnt wood inside. Damp but clearly used. A stack of small logs nearby looked like someone had taken time to split them. Everything was wet, soaked through, but it all looked recent. I knelt down near the fire ring. The wood had been burned partway, then left. Not the kind of burn you see when people go to bed. No coals, no ash bed. Just flame snuffed out, like someone left halfway through making a fire. The ground around the tent was spongy and wet, like the rest of the forest, but I didn't see any fresh footprints. No boot marks, no drag lines, nothing. Only mine. I moved to the tent. The zipper made that sticky sound as I pulled it open. Inside was a sleeping bag. Synthetic, blue and gray, half unzipped, crumpled like someone had just gotten out of it. The pad beneath was damp. A small headlamp was clipped to the inside hook of the tent. I turned it on. Battery was dead. There was a food bag hung from a branch about 10 feet off the ground nearby, using a rope and pulley someone had rigged between 2 trees. It looked well done. The kind of thing someone who camps often would set up. But the bag was ripped open. Clean slice straight through the side, like with a knife. Food wrappers, granola bars, and an empty peanut butter jar were scattered on the ground. I checked for claw marks, bite marks, anything. Nothing. Just a slit and a mess. And everything was wet, meaning this happened either during the rain or right after. I looked around again. No sign of anyone. No recent tracks. Just mine. I decided not to move my camp there. Didn't feel right. I went back to my tarp, set everything up, boiled water, ate, and tried not to think too much. But the image of that tent stuck in my head. I found old campsites before. Collapsed tarps, weathered gear, forgotten beer cans. This was different. This looked like someone had just walked away. Maybe during the rain, maybe right after. But where did they go? I didn't sleep great that night. Every crack of a branch had me turning my head. I kept telling myself the person probably packed out fast. Maybe got turned around. Maybe hiked out to their car and just left everything. But that didn't explain the food bag or why the sleeping bag was still there. No one leaves that behind. The next day, I decided to circle around the area, try to find signs of where the person might have gone. I moved in widening circles from the old site. Nothing. No prints. No gear. Just woods. Thick, wet, and quiet. I thought about packing the stuff out, the sleeping bag, the headlamp, maybe report it. But the longer I stood there, the less I wanted to touch anything. It felt like I was trespassing, like I was in someone's space that hadn't invited me. I went back to my tarp, ate a quick breakfast, packed up, and planned to head out a different way. An old logging road that might connect back to the forest road where my car was. It would add a few miles, but I felt like moving. Being still felt wrong. As I passed the site one last time on my way out, I looked through the trees toward where the tent had been. It was gone. At first I thought I had the wrong spot. I stepped through the ferns, scanned the ground. The fire ring was still there, the stack of split logs, but no tent, no sleeping bag, nothing, just wet earth and the faint impression of where the tent had been. I stood there for a long time just listening. No birds, no wind, just the sound of water dripping off branches. I felt something tight in my chest. Not panic, just that sense you get when you know something isn't right. If someone had come and packed it out, they would have had to do it early. Really early. And quiet. I would have heard them. I was camped just 30 yards away, uphill. The forest floor was wet and thick. No one moves through that silently, especially hauling gear. And again, no tracks, just mine, still there in the mud from yesterday. I didn't stick around. I followed my compass, found the old logging road, and pushed hard until I reached my car just after noon. I didn't stop for breaks. I didn't eat. I didn't look back. On the drive home, I kept replaying it. The cut food bag, the half-burnt fire, the gear left behind, then gone, and no sign of anyone. I didn't report it. I told myself maybe it was someone who got freaked out and ran off, then came back while I was out circling the area, packed up fast and quiet. But I don't believe that, because I know what it sounds like when someone moves through the woods. I know what tracks look like, and there were none. It's been months now. I still think about that sight. I went back on a dry weekend a few weeks ago just to see. The logs were still there, fire ring untouched, but no signs of any tent. No scrap of fabric, no zipper pull, nothing. Just like it had never been there at all. But I know it was, because I unzipped that tent myself. I stood inside it. I touched the sleeping bag. I saw the food wrappers scattered across the ground. And I still don't have a good answer for any of it. We had driven out late that Friday, following a dusty logging road that twisted deep into the woods. It was one of those narrow gravel roads that barely fit a single truck, lined with thick trees that leaned in as if they were trying to close over the path. My cousin and I had picked this spot weeks earlier, marking it on an old paper map he found in a drawer at his place. He liked places far off the grid. No cell signal, no other campers, just woods and quiet. That was the point. It was early fall. The air was just starting to turn cold at night, but the days were still warm enough to make hiking comfortable. We brought enough gear for 2 nights, a tent, food, a couple of knives, a fire starter, and my cousin's old .22 rifle. He never went into the woods without it. We weren't worried about bears. They were rare around there, and if they were out, they weren't looking for trouble. What stuck with me more was how isolated the place felt. Not a single sound of other people, no distant gunshots or dogs barking. Nothing like you usually hear when you're even kind of near a town. We found a small clearing, maybe 30 yards off the logging road, a flat patch of ground surrounded by pine trees. The needles were thick underfoot, soft and dry. We set up the tent on the edge of the clearing, facing away from the road. A fire pit had already been made by someone else, just a circle of blackened stones with old ash and a few half-burned sticks. It felt good to use something already there, like we weren't the first ones to find it, like it had some history. We cooked over the fire as the sun set. The trees swallowed the light fast, like they were closing in. I remember how quiet it was. No wind, no birds, not even the usual buzzing of bugs you hear around dusk. The smoke from the fire curled straight up into the air. We sat and talked for a while, mostly small stuff. Stories about past hikes, dumb stuff we did as kids, memories of our uncles taking us out to hunt when we were younger. But underneath it, I felt a little uneasy. I didn't say anything about it. Neither did he. We put out the fire around 10. The coals were still warm under the ashes when we zipped into the tent. I laid there for a while, listening to the silence. When I say silence, I mean the kind that presses down on you. No rustling, no owls, no breeze moving the trees. It was like the world was holding its breath. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I didn't know what time it was at first, but I remember my mouth was dry. My first thought was that I needed water, so I sat up slowly and reached for my pack. That's when I heard it. A cracking sound. Not loud, not fast. Just a slow, deliberate crunch of something stepping on dry sticks and pine needles. One step, pause, then another, and another. Steady, slow, coming from the trees in front of our tent. I froze. I held my breath without even meaning to. I turned my head slowly and looked at my cousin. His eyes were already open. I could see the whites of them catching the moonlight that slipped in through the tent fabric. He didn't say a word, just looked at me. We were both listening now. The steps were still there, closer than they were a minute ago, still slow. We didn't unzip the tent all the way, just enough to get a look through the little gap. The air outside felt colder than it had when we'd gone to bed. I could see shapes, the dark forms of trees and the open clearing where the fire pit had been. And then I saw it. A man, squatting low under one of the pine trees, maybe 25 or 30 feet away. He wasn't walking anymore, just crouched, still, facing the tent. There was no doubt about it. He wasn't wearing hunter's orange or any reflective gear. No flashlight, just a man in the woods, in the middle of the night watching our tent. We stayed still for a long time. I don't know how long. Long enough that I started to feel the cold seeping through the floor of the tent into my legs. My cousin didn't move either, though I saw his hand slowly reach for something near his sleeping bag, probably the rifle. The man didn't move, not once. He just stayed crouched under the trees, watching. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I knew he was facing us. The way his shoulders were square to the tent, the tilt of his head, like he was trying to listen. At some point, the sound stopped completely again. No more branches cracking, no footsteps, just stillness. My cousin finally leaned toward me and, very slowly, mouthed something. I couldn't read his lips perfectly, but I caught the gist. Don't do anything stupid. I didn't plan to. We stayed there like that until the cold made it too hard to keep still. I started shivering. The man didn't move. Then, just as slow as the sound had come, it went. I didn't hear him walk away. He just wasn't there anymore. We waited. 5 minutes. 10. Still nothing. Then 20. Finally, my cousin unzipped the tent fully and stepped out with the rifle. I followed. The fire pit was as we'd left it. The coals were cold now. No sign of anyone. We walked to the tree where the man had crouched. There were footprints, barely visible in the pine needles, but they were there. Human prints, deep enough to show he had stood there a while. No shoes, just dark impressions of someone's feet, maybe wearing boots. Not barefoot. We circled the camp slowly, staying close to each other. Nothing, not a single sound. No broken branches that led off into the woods. No gear or trash. Just those prints and the heavy feeling of being watched. We didn't go back to sleep. We packed up the essentials, our bags, the rifle, the flashlight, and we sat by the cold fire pit until the sky began to lighten. When the sun finally rose enough to cut through the trees, we broke down the tent and hiked back to the truck. We didn't talk much on the walk out. We kept looking behind us, though. Every few minutes, one of us would glance back down the trail. When we reached the truck, we looked down the logging road in both directions before unlocking it. We threw our stuff in fast, not bothering to fold anything properly. I remember the way my hands shook trying to get the key in the ignition. It started on the first try. We backed out, turned around, and didn't stop until we were well past the tree line. When we got back to town, we didn't go to our own houses. We stopped at a diner and got breakfast. We sat there for over an hour. Just sat. I think we needed to feel normal again, around other people, somewhere with walls and lights and noise. We didn't report anything. There was nothing to report. No crime, no damage. Just a man in the woods at night, watching us without a word. My cousin said maybe it was a hunter, but we both knew it wasn't. No one hunts like that. No one stalks a campsite in total silence without making themselves known. And no hunter I've ever met crouches under trees at 2 in the morning staring at tents. We never went back to that spot. I've camped since then plenty of times, but never that deep in. Never without a signal. And never without telling at least 2 people exactly where we're going. That night changed something in me. I've always loved the woods. Still do. But now I respect them differently. The trees can hide things. The quiet can mean more than just peace. Sometimes silence is the loudest warning you'll ever get. There are people out there who don't want to be found. People who move in the dark, who wait. Maybe he thought we were someone else. Maybe he was just curious. Or maybe he had a reason to watch and wait that night. We'll never know. But I'll never forget the way he crouched there, still as stone, like he'd done it before, like he knew exactly how to go unseen. We were lucky, that's all I know. We were lucky that man just watched, and nothing else. I'd been hiking solo in northern Idaho for 3 days, carrying everything I needed on my back. I wasn't deep into the mountains, but deep enough that I hadn't seen another person since the small parking area where I started. No cell signal out there either. I chose that stretch of trail because it was remote but still maintained well enough by the Forest Service. It was supposed to be peaceful, quiet. I'd done solo hikes before, some even longer than this one, but I always carried a satellite beacon, first aid, bear spray, and an emergency bivvy. I wasn't stupid, but still, when you're out there alone for long enough, your senses start to stretch thin. It was the 4th day. I'd broken camp at around 7 a.m. after a cold breakfast of granola and dried fruit, packed up, and started moving. The woods were damp from a storm the night before. Everything smelled of wet pine, and the trail was soft underfoot. A few low clouds were hanging in the trees. It was quiet like it always is in the early hours, but that morning the quiet felt off. Not peaceful, hollow like a sound that had been sucked out of the air. About 2 hours into the hike, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. The trail ahead dipped slightly, where a small runoff stream sometimes cuts through after rain. The soil was still dark from the storm, and in the middle of it, cutting across the trail and dragging into the underbrush, were 2 long marks in the dirt. Fresh marks, maybe 6 feet long each. 2 grooves, spaced apart about the width of a person's shoulders. It looked like something heavy had been dragged off the trail. The soil was still wet, and the smears were sharp at the edges, not dried or wind-blown at all. Recent. I stood there for a long time, longer than I should have. Listening. Nothing. I scanned the trees, the slope above, and down into the brush below. No movement. No sounds of animals, no rustling. Just those long drag marks heading into the woods, and no return trail. No boot prints. No wheel marks. Just those 2 grooves. I wasn't armed with a gun. Just bear spray strapped to my chest. I'm not a paranoid person, but something about those marks made my stomach go tight. My heart started hammering just like that. I stepped back and took a long loop around, bushwhacking uphill to avoid walking directly past whatever had been pulled off the trail. I didn't look down into the brush. I didn't want to see what might be down there. I kept my eyes on the trail ahead, moving faster than usual, one hand on the canister of spray even though I didn't know what good that would do. 2 miles later, my legs were sore from the quick pace. I'd made it up the ridge and started dropping into the next hollow. That's when I saw them. Pair of glasses, right in the middle of the trail. Thin black frames, mud-caked. One lens cracked all the way through. They looked like they'd been stepped on, but not crushed entirely. Just bent, broken. There were pine needles stuck to them, and a little patch of damp soil on the inside of one lens. No case, no pack. Just the glasses sitting dead center in the path like someone had set them down there. I didn't stop. I didn't touch them. I didn't even slow down. I just looked for a second, kept walking, and pushed myself until I got another 4 miles out. I didn't want to camp anywhere near that spot. Didn't even want to be within a few miles of it. That night, I barely slept. I set up my tent off-trail behind a rock outcrop, trying to stay out of sight. I hung my food like always, but my hands were shaking as I did it. I kept my bear spray inside my sleeping bag, just resting against my chest. Every twig snap outside jolted me awake. My heart pounded every time the wind shifted through the trees. I left at first light and didn't stop moving until noon. My feet were blistered. My thighs were sore. I barely ate, just drank water, shoved trail mix into my mouth, and kept moving. I didn't even enjoy the landscape anymore. I was just trying to get out. When I finally made it back to the trailhead, the parking lot was empty except for my car. Everything was just like I left it. I sat there in the driver's seat for a while before I started the engine, just trying to slow my breathing. My hands were shaking, but not from exhaustion. I didn't tell anyone when I got home. I didn't even write about it in my trip journal, which I always did after hikes. I just kept thinking about those drag marks and those glasses. I don't know who they belonged to. I don't know what happened out there. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was something I don't want to know. But I haven't been back to northern Idaho since. I still hike, still go solo sometimes, but never that deep, never that far from people. And I never ever ignore the feeling in my gut again, because something happened out there, something bad, and whatever it was, it didn't want to be found. I can't forget the way those glasses looked, like they'd been dropped by someone in a hurry, or maybe knocked off, bent, broken, and left there like a final marker. I never found a name, never saw anything on the news. Maybe it hadn't been reported, or maybe no one ever found out. But sometimes I think about the person who wore them, if they're still out there, or if they're the reason I got that sick feeling in my chest when I saw those drag marks. Like I'd walked right past something I shouldn't have seen, something that didn't want to be seen. And maybe the only reason I got out of there was because I kept walking. I never stopped again.